stand on the platforms of Manchester Piccadilly today, and trains arrive every 90 seconds from London, Liverpool, and Leeds. Over 30 million passengers pass through this station each year, threading through a city of 500,000 people whose metropolitan area holds nearly 3 million more. But rewind 250 years, and you would have found a market town of 10,000 souls clustered around a medieval bridge, its economy built on wool and linen, its skyline dominated by a single church tower. Cotton. Steam. Iron. Revolution. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every century of Manchester's story, from a Roman fort on the banks of the Medlock to the global metropolis you can visit today. This is the city that invented the modern world, that turned thread into empire, that proved a single human lifetime could witness the transformation from village to industrial colossus. This is Manchester. The story begins in 79 CE, when Roman governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola ordered the construction of a wooden fort at the confluence of the river Medlock and the river Irwell. The Romans called it Mamucium, derived from the Celtic words for breast-shaped hill, a reference to the gentle sandstone rise on which the fort stood. This was not a glamorous posting. Mamucium sat on the northernmost edge of the Roman world's comfort zone, a garrison designed to suppress the brigands' tribe and secure the road between the legionary fortresses of Chester and York. The fort measured roughly 500 feet on each side, its timber walls enclosing barracks for 500 auxiliary soldiers. By 200 CE, the timber had been replaced with stone. A civilian settlement, a vicus, grew up outside the fort's southern gate, workshops, taverns, a bathhouse fed by wooden aqueducts. Archaeological excavations at Castle Field have uncovered hypercaust heating systems, Samian pottery from Gaul, and a stone altar dedicated to the goddess Fortuna. The altar is now in Manchester Museum. When Rome withdrew its legions from Britannia in 410 CE, Mamucium did not collapse overnight. The stone walls remained. The roads remained. But the people who knew how to read, write, and administer a province left, and within a generation the settlement shrank to a shadow. By 500 CE, the fort was a ruin used for shelter by farmers. The name survived, though barely, corrupted through centuries of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon tongues into Mancunium, then Mamacista. Manchester's first incarnation ended not with fire but with demographic emptiness, a stone skeleton on a hill. The place stirred again in the 7th century. Anglo-Saxon settlers built timber halls near the old Roman site, and by 919 CE, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Edward the Elder ordering the repair of Manchester's defences to guard against Viking incursions from the Danelaw to the east. The settlement became a minor manorial estate. In 1086, the Domesday Book lists Manchester as part of the Barony of Salford, valued at £10, with a population estimated at 200. It was a village, nothing more. The medieval transformation began in 1222, when the lord of the manor, Thomas Grelly, secured a royal charter to hold a weekly market. Markets meant trade, trade meant people, and people meant money. By 1301, Manchester had been granted the right to hold an annual fair lasting 3 days, a magnet for wool merchants from the Pennines and cloth traders from Flanders. The town grew along a single main street, now Market Street, flanked by timber-framed houses with thatched roofs. In 1421, Thomas de la Warre founded a collegiate church on the site of an earlier Saxon chapel. This church, dedicated to St. Mary, St. Denis, and St. George, would later become Manchester Cathedral. Its perpendicular Gothic nave, completed over the next century, was the tallest structure for 20 miles. By 1540, the population had reached 2,000. Manchester's medieval economy rested on wool and linen. Water power from the Irk, Medlock, and Irwell drove fulling mills where wool cloth was pounded and cleaned. German merchants visiting in 1560 described Manchester as a town of clothiers whose work was sold in London and exported to the Low Countries. The wool trade brought modest prosperity, enough to rebuild the market cross in stone, enough to endow grammar schools, enough to keep the plague of 1605 from completely emptying the streets. But Manchester remained a town, not a city. It had no cathedral diocese, no parliamentary borough, no walls. When the English Civil War erupted in 1642, Manchester's residents declared for Parliament, and royalist forces besieged the town twice. Both sieges failed. Manchester's earthwork defences, hastily thrown up around the medieval core, held. The war left scars but also pride, a reputation for dissent, for self-government, for resisting authority. That defiance would define the centuries to come. In 1750, Manchester's population stood at 18,000. By 1800, it had reached 90,000. By 1850, it had exploded to 300,000. No city in human history had grown so fast. The cause was cotton. Raw cotton arrived in Liverpool from plantations in the American South and the Caribbean, was carted overboard to Manchester's warehouses, and was transformed by machines into thread and cloth for export across the British Empire. The first cotton mill in Manchester opened in 1783 on Miller Street, powered by a Bolton and Watt steam engine. Within 20 years, there were 52 mills. Within 40 years, there were hundreds. The machines ran day and night. Richard Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, and Edmund Cartwright's power loom turned processes that had taken a hand spinner hours into operations completed in minutes. A single steam-powered mule could produce as much thread as 200 hand spinners. The productivity was staggering. By 1830, Manchester and its satellite towns produced half of the world's cotton cloth. The city became known as Cottonopolis. Visitors described a forest of brick chimneys belching coal smoke, the clatter of looms audible from miles away, streets thick with horse-drawn carts piled with bales of raw cotton and finished fabric. The Bridgewater Canal, completed in 1761, connected Manchester to the coal mines of Worsley. The Rochdale Canal and the Ashton Canal followed, threading the city into a web of industrial waterways. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, the world's first intercity passenger railway. George Stephenson's locomotive rocket pulled carriages at 30 miles per hour, a speed contemporaries described as demonic. The railway carried 1 million passengers in its first year. Manchester became the world's first industrial metropolis, the proof that steam and capital could reshape human settlement. But the revolution came at a cost. Workers, many of them children, labored 14-hour shifts in mills where the air was thick with cotton dust that destroyed lungs. Entire families lived in single-room cellar dwellings with no windows and no sanitation. Friedrich Engels arrived in Manchester in 1842 to work in his father's cotton firm and was horrified by what he saw. His book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, documented streets where human waste ran in open gutters, where cholera killed thousands, where the average life expectancy in working-class districts was 17 years. Engels wrote, "Everywhere half or wholly ruined buildings, the walls crumbling, doorposts and window frames loose and broken, doors of old boards nailed together." He met Karl Marx in a Manchester pub in 1844. The two men's collaboration began there, in the shadow of the mills. Manchester's wealth was built on cotton and coal, but it was also built on slavery. The raw cotton came from plantations worked by enslaved people in the American South. When the American Civil War began in 1861 and the Union Navy blockaded Confederate ports, the supply of cotton to Manchester stopped. The Lancashire cotton famine threw 500,000 people out of work. Mill owners shuttered factories. Workers starved. Despite their suffering, Manchester's working-class communities publicly supported Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of slavery. Lincoln wrote a letter of thanks to the working men of Manchester in 1863. That letter is displayed in Manchester's Lincoln Square today. Manchester's industrial workers had created unprecedented wealth, but they had no political voice. In 1819, Manchester had no Member of Parliament. Voting rights were restricted to a tiny class of landowners. On August 16, 1819, 60,000 men, women, and children gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Field in central Manchester to demand parliamentary reform. They carried banners reading universal suffrage and vote by ballot. The speaker was Henry Hunt, a radical orator. Magistrates, terrified by the size of the crowd and convinced revolution was imminent, ordered the local yeomanry cavalry to arrest Hunt. The yeomanry charged into the crowd with sabers drawn. Panic erupted. People were crushed, trampled, slashed. 18 people were killed. Over 700 were injured. The massacre was immediately dubbed Peterloo, a bitter echo of the Battle of Waterloo 4 years earlier. The government praised the magistrates. Public outrage erupted across Britain. Percy Shelley wrote The Mask of Anarchy in response, "I met murder on the way. He had a mask like castlery." Peterloo became a rallying cry. It took another 13 years, but in 1832 the Great Reform Act extended the vote to middle-class men and gave Manchester its first 2 members of Parliament. The city became a powerhouse of liberal and radical politics. In 1838, the Anti-Corn Law League was founded in Manchester by Richard Cobden and John Bright. The League campaigned to repeal tariffs on imported grain that kept bread prices high and protected landowners at the expense of workers. Their headquarters on Newell's Buildings became the nerve centre of Britain's first modern political pressure campaign, using pamphlets, public meetings, and statistical arguments. The Corn Laws were repealed in 1846. Manchester's municipal government was equally radical. The city was granted a charter of incorporation in 1838, creating an elected town council. In 1853, the council opened the first free public library in Britain, designed to bring knowledge to working people. The library's inaugural speaker was Charles Dickens, who said, "I am here to advocate the cause of that public, that working public, in whose advancement I believe all other classes must be interested." The council built public parks, public baths, public hospitals. In 1894, the Manchester Ship Canal opened, a 36-mile artificial waterway connecting the city directly to the Irish Sea. It was the largest navigation canal in the world, built by 20,000 labourers over 6 years. The canal turned landlocked Manchester into a major port, bypassing Liverpool's docks and cutting shipping costs. By 1900, Manchester was the 9th largest city in the world. Its town hall, completed in 1877, was a Gothic revival palace designed by Alfred Waterhouse, its great hall lined with murals depicting the city's history. The building announced Manchester's identity: industrial, radical, proud. The city had forced Britain to modernize. It had shown that workers could organize, that cities could govern themselves, that the future belonged to those who dared to imagine it differently. The 20th century tested Manchester's resilience. The First World War killed 17,000 Manchester men. The cotton trade, already facing competition from India and Japan, never recovered. Mills began closing in the 1920s. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought mass unemployment. By 1931, Manchester's population had peaked at 766,000 and began a slow decline. The Second World War brought devastation. Manchester was a strategic target. Its factories produced munitions, aircraft engines, and Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for Spitfires. On the nights of December the 22nd and 23rd, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched the Christmas Blitz. Over 2 nights, German bombers dropped 400 tons of high explosives and thousands of incendiary bombs. The city centre burned. The Free Trade Hall, symbol of Manchester's liberal heritage, was gutted. Over 600 people were killed. Entire streets were reduced to rubble. The city rebuilt, but the post-war decades were hard. The cotton industry collapsed completely. By 1960, most of the great mills stood empty or had been demolished. Manchester's population drained to the suburbs. The city centre became a landscape of car parks and concrete. The slum clearances of the 1960s demolished Victorian housing and replaced it with high-rise tower blocks that quickly became synonymous with poverty and crime. By the 1980s, Manchester was a symbol of post-industrial decline. Unemployment exceeded 20% in some neighborhoods. The 1996 IRA bombing, which detonated a truck bomb in the city center and injured over 200 people, seemed like a final insult. Yet Manchester responded not with despair but with reinvention. The bombing's destruction cleared space for a radical redesign of the city centre. Architects rebuilt around pedestrian spaces, public squares, and new cultural institutions. In 2002, Manchester hosted the Commonwealth Games, and the Olympic infrastructure, stadiums, housing, tram lines, became the skeleton of a regenerated city. The mills were converted into apartments and creative studios. The old industrial canals became leisure waterfronts. Manchester's rebirth was not just economic but cultural. The city had always produced outsized contributions to British life. The Manchester Guardian, founded in 1821, became The Guardian, one of the world's most respected newspapers. The Halley Orchestra, founded in 1858, was Britain's first professional orchestra. In the 1960s and 1970s, Granada Television produced Coronation Street, the world's longest-running television soap opera. In the 1980s, Manchester became the centre of British alternative music. Factory Records, co-founded by Tony Wilson, released seminal albums by Joy Division and New Order. The Hacienda nightclub, opened in 1982, became the birthplace of acid house and rave culture in the UK. The Stone Roses, the Smiths, Oasis, bands that defined British guitar music, all emerged from Manchester's council estates and rehearsal rooms. The city's scientific legacy is equally towering. John Dalton developed atomic theory in Manchester in the early 19th century. James Joule discovered the first law of thermodynamics here in 1843. Ernest Rutherford split the atom at the University of Manchester in 1917. Alan Turing, the father of computer science, worked at the University of Manchester after the Second World War, developing one of the world's first stored program computers. In 2004, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov isolated graphene at the University of Manchester, a discovery that won them the Nobel Prize in Physics. Today, the University of Manchester is one of the largest and most prestigious research universities in Europe, with over 40,000 students from more than 160 countries. Stand in St. Peter's Square today, and you stand on the site of Peterloo, of the Free Trade Hall, of the IRA bomb crater. Trams glide past every few minutes. Students sit on the steps of the Central Library. Office workers eat lunch beneath the statue of John Bright. Manchester's population is growing again, fastest of any major British city outside London. The old Cottonopolis is now a city of universities, hospitals, media companies, and tech startups. But walk down the side streets, and you still find red brick mill buildings with their original iron window frames, still bearing the names of the men who built them. The cotton is gone. The smoke is gone. The revolution is over. But the city that created the modern world, that proved human beings could reshape their lives in a single generation, that turned thread into empire and suffering into reform, that city endures. Manchester refused to die. It reinvented itself. And it is not finished yet.